Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. Today we're going to unpack a mystery from 16th century Europe that honestly sounds like a complete myth. But the crazy thing is, it's entirely documented in historical records, physician notes, and cathedral sermons. We're talking about the Dancing Plague of 1518. It's an event that really forces us to question the strange, hidden connections between our minds, our bodies, and the society we live in. So let's dive right into this.
Picture this. You're walking down the bustling cobblestone streets of Strasbourg during the Renaissance. All around you are these historically accurate, timber-framed medieval buildings. But suddenly, this totally normal European city is transformed into a scene of absolute exhaustion and confusion. You see dozens of men and women, all dressed in heavy, authentic 16th century clothing, just dancing uncontrollably in the middle of the town square. And watching them are these distressed family members, perplexed physicians, worried priests, merchants, and curious citizens, all standing perfectly still in absolute disbelief. It's this wild, stark contrast, right? The relentless, chaotic thrashing of the dancers against the fearful stillness of the crowd. It leaves us wondering, what on earth could have caused one of history's strangest mass events?
Part 1, The Frenzy Begins, July 1518, Strasbourg.
We begin our investigation in the sweltering summer of 1518. Now, this wasn't a slow-burning crisis. It was a single, inexplicable event that triggered a massive catastrophe. On July 14th, a woman named Frau Trophia steps outside her home and just begins to dance. There's no music. She ignores her husband begging her to stop. She just dances until she collapses, wakes up, and starts all over again, even with her feet swollen and bleeding. After about 4 to 6 days of this trance-like jigging, the terrified authorities finally bundle her into a wagon and sent her 30 miles away to Cyberne. But, well, the damage was already done. The visual of her bizarre performance had planted a seed. Within days, 30 citizens are mimicking her. Fast forward a month, and the epidemic peaks with a staggering 400 exhausted citizens joining in. First-hand accounts from the time really capture the sheer scale of this madness. Take this 17th century poem by jurist Johann Schilter. It documents how incredibly public the whole thing was. The dancers didn't hide away. They were hopping and spinning in the busy horse and grain markets, down narrow alleys, and out on the main streets, literally day and night. They barely stopped to eat or drink. It was just an ungodly spectacle of flailing arms and spasms.
And behind that wild spectacle was a staggering human cost. To put this into perspective, at the height of the plague, up to 15 people were dying every single day. Their bodies just gave out. We're talking heart attacks, strokes, and pure, absolute physical exhaustion. Dancing to death wasn't just some poetic metaphor here. It was a grim daily reality for the people of Strasbourg.
Moving on to Part 2, Curing Evil with Evil, the Medical Missteps. So, faced with this mounting death toll and a totally baffled public, the desperate authorities had to step in. But, as you'll see, their well-intentioned fixes were deeply flawed and basically poured gasoline on the fire. The city's leaders were totally split on how to handle these sweaty, glassy-eyed victims. On one side, you had the physicians. They applied the medical theory of the day, declaring that a natural fever caused by overheated blood. Their solution? Don't bleed them, make them dance more, to sweat it out. On the flip side, the clergy insisted it was a divine curse sent by St. Vitus, which meant they needed spiritual penance.
Ultimately, the city council decided to side with the doctors. Believing this was a natural disease that just needed to be aggressively sweat out, the Privy Council enacted a truly astonishing plan. They literally had carpenters build wooden stages in the bustling horse market. Then they paid dozens of professional musicians to play drums, fiddles, and horns. They even brought in healthy, robust dancers just to keep the exhausted victims moving. I mean, they essentially built a 16th century nightclub right in the middle of the town square.
But here's the thing, creating a massive public spectacle completely backfired. By putting the dancers on a literal pedestal with loud, driving music, the council inadvertently lured even more fearful citizens into the mania. Seeing this total disaster unfold, the authorities had to pivot, and fast. They tore down the stages and slapped a strict ban on almost all public music. Interestingly enough, stringed instruments were still okay for private weddings, but heavy percussion, like tambourines and drums, strictly forbidden. The authorities likely realized those hypnotic rhythms were triggering the madness.
So, abandoning the medical approach, the council turned to religion. They bundled the worst, most twitchy victims into wagons and hauled them 30 miles to the shrine of St. Vitus in Saverne. Once there, priests subjected them to a super-structured religious ritual. They placed them under a wooden carving, gave them small crosses to hold, and fitted them with special red shoes painted with crosses of consecrated oil.
And miraculously, in that atmosphere, thick with incense and Latin chanting, the contagion finally started to slow down.
Part 3. The false culprits, suspects of the era.
The plague eventually faded by late summer, but for centuries, experts obsessed over what actually happened. And if we comb through the history books, we find a lot of folks pointing fingers at the wrong suspects. For example, 8 years after the event, the famous physician Paracelsus visited Strasbourg. His theory? Deeply misogynistic. He claimed Frau Tryphaea totally faked the whole thing just to embarrass her husband. He called it Sharia lasciva, meaning it was driven by voluptuous desires and impertinent thoughts among women. Now, while Paracelsus was actually right that the cause was in the mind, not from the heavens, his theory completely ignored the deep psychological trauma happening, and honestly, it's totally dismissed today.
Fast forward to the 20th century, and a lot of modern historians started blaming ergot fungus. It's a mind-altering mold that grows on damp rye, historically known as St. Anthony's fire, and it causes hallucinations. Makes sense, right? Well, actually, scratch that. The medical reality of ergot poisoning makes this impossible. See, ergot severely restricts blood flow to the extremities. As historian John Waller points out, a person poisoned by ergot literally could not maintain that relentless marathon-level physical output for days on end. Their limbs would physically seize up.
Part 4. A mind under pressure. The ambient seawater. So, if they weren't faking it, and they weren't tripping on toxic mold, what the heck was it? Well, to find the real culprit, we have to look past the actual dancing and examine the brutal reality of everyday life for these citizens. Let's dive into the scientific explanation that modern psychologists widely accept today: mass psychogenic illness, or MPI. And let's be clear, this is not people faking it. It is an involuntary, deeply physical manifestation of overwhelming psychological distress. It happens when severe, chronic stress directly hacks the human nervous system. It produces genuine bodily symptoms, tremors, dizziness, uncontrollable movements, and it spreads through a group like wildfire via social contagion, not a biological virus.
When you look at the stressors in 1518 Strasbourg, it paints a terrifyingly clear picture. We are looking at a population absolutely drowning in trauma. They had endured decades of recurrent bad harvests and extreme famine. The horrifying new disease of syphilis had just arrived. Throw in extreme social inequality, political instability, and this pervasive, terrifying belief that saints like Vitus would literally curse them for their sins, and you've got the ultimate pressure cooker for extreme human behavior. There is this absolutely fantastic quote from historian H.C. Eric Middlefort that hits the nail on the head. He says, "Historical madnesses are like jellyfish. They collapse, dry up, and make zero sense when you remove them from their ambient seawater." To understand why hundreds of people danced until their feet literally bled, we can't just isolate the dancing. We have to immerse ourselves in that dark, terrifying ambient seawater of their daily starvation, fear, and suffering in 1518.
Part 5. The power of suggestion. Social contagion. So how exactly does profound background stress transform into a highly specific dancing epidemic? It all comes down to the remarkable vulnerability of the human brain. Think of it like a chain reaction. First, prolonged, crushing anxiety makes a population hyper-aware of their own bodies. Then, a trigger event happens, Frau Tryphaea breaking into her involuntary dance. Crucially, the community's cultural beliefs kick in to frame the event. They genuinely believe she's cursed by St. Vitus, and because they share that exact same fear and stress, the distressed onlookers involuntarily start mimicking her symptoms. The brain effectively writes a script for the body, entirely based on cultural expectations.
Part 6. Echoes in the modern world. It still happens. Now, you might be looking at all this and thinking, wow, glad that was just a bizarre medieval anomaly. But the truth is, our brains are wired the exact same way today. The psychological mechanisms haven't changed one bit. Take the 1963 laughing epidemic in Tanganyika, which is modern-day Tanzania. It started with 2 schoolgirls and spread until entire schools had to shut down for weeks. We see it today with inexplicable fainting spells in schools globally, or genuine physical symptoms manifesting in towns terrified of unproven environmental toxins. And honestly, historians even point to modern rave culture. People enter trance states and dance for days with minimal rest, entirely marginalizing their perception of pain and exhaustion.
But here is the absolutely crucial takeaway for us today. While medieval folks had to rely on the local town square to observe and spread mass psychogenic illness, we carry a much, much faster vector right in our pockets. Social media can rapidly magnify group fears and collective anxiety. It acts as a digital vector, spreading panic and genuine physical symptoms across the globe at lightning speed. The contagion of distress is literally no longer limited by geography.
So, as we leave those exhausted cobblestone streets of 1518 behind, we have to take a hard look at our own era of chronic stress, economic anxiety, and viral information. The dancing plague wasn't some ancient eradicated disease. It was a deeply human response to unbearable pressure. Which leaves us with one final, memorable question. In our hyper-connected world, when our modern pressure cooker finally boils over, what form will the dancing plagues of our future take?